Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 6th annual Berkeley Lecture on Religious Tolerance. My name is Jonathan Sheehan, and I am Professor of History and co-director with my colleague Mark Csikszentmihalyi, who's sitting over there, from East Asian Languages and Cultures, co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. So before we get started, just a word about the lecture in the series, neither of which would have been possible without the support from the Endowed Fund for the Study of Religious Tolerance. The fund was established by Andy Rowan, sitting over here, a member of the class of 1976, to enable the university to promote and disseminate research on religious tolerance and intolerance in the hope of deepening our understanding of religion's many roles in our modern world. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for your generosity in supporting this project. Moreover, 2017 and 2018 has been a tremendous year here at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Generally, lots of events, as most of you know. None of these would have been possible without the support of our humanities and social science deans, Anthony Cascardi from the Side of the Humanities, and Carla Hessa on the social sciences. None would have been possible without the support of a tremendous staff. And none would have been possible without the interest that all of you here have shown us. If you're interested in the activities of the center or in finding out how to support our future projects, there's a table with materials, as well as a sign-up sheet for our email newsletter just out the door, if you haven't done that already. Okay, so there by way of formalities. Without further ado then, it gives me great pleasure this afternoon, to introduce our speaker, Professor Lee Eric Schmidt, who's the Edward C. Mallinckrodt Distinguished University Professor of Humanities at Washington University in the great city of St. Louis. One of the great pleasures of directing this center for me is having the opportunity to bring people whose work you love and share them with the Berkeley campus and community. I met, so to speak, Lee Schmidt in 2001 when I was a baby professor trying to catch hold of a curious relationship between religion and enlightenment. And as you can see by my post-its, this is my copy and my post-its from 17 years ago in my copy of that book, Lee Schmidt's book, Hearing Things, Religion, Illusion, and the American Enlightenment, was a key conversation partner for me. So the book was the kind of book I wanted to write. When I read it, it was before I had written a book. It's learned and it was joyful at the same time. Historians sometimes have a reputation anyways for being a crabbed lot, sort of aficionados of the details, the footnote, and Schmidt was something different, someone who let his glance take in big pictures in American religion in the 18th century and yet also linger on the characters and quirks with a serious pleasure. In Schmidt there was, and I think is, the kind of creative restlessness that for me marks a great historian, someone who's always on the hunt for big issues that matter. And since 2001, since I first met this book, Schmidt has become, in my opinion, our foremost historian of the American religious experience from the 18th century to our own time. He's written books on the idiosyncratically zany, so here's one title that I just don't think you just have to repeat the title. Heaven's Bride, The Unprintable Life of Ira C. Craddock, American mystic, scholar, sexologist, martyr, and madwoman. Written books on the most sacred ritual of American society, that is buying Christmas presents. He's written books on American spiritualism, from yoga to transcendentalism to nature mysticism to New Age, and several other books besides. So it's a truism, it's repeated ad nausea, that America is a religious nation, and Schmidt has spent many years trying to understand exactly what the terms of this American religion might be, with attention to the surprising forms that religion takes well above and beyond your standard upright church-going, God-fearing Protestant. In his last book, and that's this one here, Village Atheists, How America's Unbelievers Made Their Way in a godly nation. I almost said godless nation, but it's godly nation. He turns his attention to the truism itself. What does it mean to say that we're a religious nation anyways? What about all those people who reject the idea altogether? The American atheist, the American freethinker, the American secularist, all the other words that in the late 19th century and often still today might not only be construed as insults, but also in a funny way, if the truism is true, contradictions in terms. Now, if, as our polling data still seems to indicate, atheists are among the least trusted minorities around in America, the past century and a half have seen an incredible change in our common culture, from the rise of so-called religious nuns, those who say click the box none on their survey, to the best-selling works of the new atheists, and atheism has become almost respectable. How that happened, the curious bedfellows that tangled politics, the local conflicts, the unexpected outcomes, the curious people involved, these are the bread and butter of Schmidt's stories. He tells it in this book. And today he'll tell us part of it. In fact, I think he's going to extend it in a talk entitled, Are Atheists Tolerable? American Nonbelievers and Irreligious Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Lee Schmidt.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it when my restlessness is seen as creative and not unhinged or annoying. Sometimes it seems more in those latter categories. And thanks also to Patty for her work on this, and Brandon and for helping organize this event. Woven into modern constructions of religious liberty is an enduring conundrum. Does religious freedom include irreligious freedom? In his foundational essay, A Letter Concerning Toleration in 1689, John Locke decidedly thought not. Arguing for sharp limits on the state's power to impose or suppress particular modes of worship, Locke concerned himself especially with accommodating different varieties of Protestant Christianity, but he did not end there. His principle of religious toleration was much more sweeping than that. Neither pagan, nor Mahometan, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion, he wrote. This was heady stuff. Locke's principle of religious liberty applied very widely indeed. Christians, Jews, Muslims, and pagans, the standard fourfold way of imagining the world's religious variety in the late 17th century, all were included under the umbrella of toleration. Alas, Locke ran up against a crucial limitation: atheists and unbelievers. Those are not at all to be tolerated to deny the being of a God, he declared. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though but even in thought, dissolves all. Besides, also, those that by their atheism undermine and destroy all religion can have no pretense of religion whereupon to challenge the privilege of a toleration. Religious toleration did not include irreligious toleration. Religious liberty was specifically for the religious, not the irreligious. The 19th century American Protestant apologist Robert Baird echoed this same principle in his Religion in America in 1844, which was a standard guidebook on the nation's evangelical churches and its pervasively Christian character. Rights of conscience are religious rights, Baird insisted. That is, rights to entertain and utter religious opinions and to enjoy public religious worship. Now, this expression, even in its widest acceptation, cannot include irreligion, opinions contrary to the nature of religion, subversive of the reverence, love, and service due to God, of virtue, morality, and good manners. What rights of conscience can atheism, irreligion, and licentiousness pretend to? Or, as a Minneapolis newspaper blithely editorialized in 1904, we claim religious freedom for our strongest plank in our national foundations, but irreligious freedom is another matter entirely. Let a man believe what he likes. Let him believe, however. Another half century on, Richard Nixon drew the same line at irreligion when he offered John F. Kennedy an olive branch of toleration for his Roman Catholic faith in the 1960 presidential election. There is only one way that I can visualize religion being a legitimate issue in an American political campaign, Nixon said. That would be if one of the candidates for the presidency had no religious belief. The unacceptability of atheists in civil society long remained a cultural commonplace. Few rushed to defend the rights and liberties of unbelievers in the 17th and 18th centuries, but there were certainly some inklings. The Virginia Act for Establishing Religious Freedom in 1786, the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, had enjoined that religious opinions and beliefs should in no way diminish or enlarge a citizen's civil capacities. Jefferson later specified in his autobiography that he expressly intended the bill to reach beyond the religious to the irreligious, that it comprehended within its mantle of protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel. Likewise, John Adams, writing to his son John Quincy Adams in 1816, insisted that government has no right to hurt a hair of the head of an atheist for his opinions. He did, however, go on to admonish, let him have a care of his practices. As Adams' caveat suggested, even when toleration was extended to atheists and unbelievers, it was often done so with an abundance of caution. Could they be counted on as virtuous citizens? Could they be trusted as witnesses in courtrooms or as holders of public office? Could they be accorded the rights of free speech and assembly without their blasphemies subverting public order and morality? Was their freedom to express irreligious opinions about God or the Bible or the virgin birth the same as for those who conveyed more pious perspectives? Such questions were debated time and again in American public life from the early republic forward and were far from easily resolved. A progressive storyline about the toleration of atheists and the advance of the secularist principle of equal citizenship for unbelievers would not be hard to plot. Locke's view of atheists as wild beasts to be excluded from civil society sounds entirely illiberal, all but inexplicable by the Jeffersonian standards of church-state separation that prevailed by the middle decades of the 20th century. In a series of landmark decisions, from McCollum v. Board of Education in 1948 through Abington v. Schmidt in 1963, the Supreme Court, guided especially by the opinions of Justice Hugo Black, made the even-handed treatment of believers and non-believers integral to its construal of the First Amendment. This is a picture of the Schmidt family. They were the ones challenging Bible reading and the Lord's Prayer in the Pennsylvania schools. And here, they were Unitarian, which one lawyer said, couldn't we find a real Christian family to make this challenge? But here they posed with their Bible to assure people that while they didn't want devotional Bible reading in public schools, they weren't opposed to Bible reading in the family. So even Justice Potter Stewart, the lone dissenter in the Schmidt case, embraced Black's principle that the religious and the irreligious enjoy the same rights and liberties. What our Constitution indispensably protects, Potter wrote, is the freedom of each of us, be he Jew or agnostic, Christian or atheist, Buddhist or freethinker, to believe or disbelieve, to worship or not worship, to pray or keep silent, according to his own conscience, uncoerced and unrestrained by government. How this leveled playing field was supposed to work in practice, however, remained much in dispute. Did it apply to the national motto, "In God We Trust," or the phrase, "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance? Did it apply to humanist chaplaincies in the military, to nativity scenes in public parks, or to prayers before municipal board meetings? This much, though, was hard to dispute. Atheists and non-believers were on far firmer constitutional ground by 1965 than they had been in 1791, let alone 1689. How much firmer, though? The ground was obviously more shifting and treacherous than the panoramic view from Locke to Black suggests. The progressive storyline was necessarily more potholed. The cases that atheist and secularist plaintiffs pursued in the mid-20th century often came at considerable personal cost. Publicly vilified, many of them faced significant harassment, intimidation, and social dislocation. As free-thinking activists for very strict constructions of church-state separation, they routinely ran afoul of religious sensibilities that wove together church, home, community, and school as the essential fabric of a God-blessed nation. Justice William Douglas, suspicious of the growing height of Jefferson's wall of separation, worried in 1952 about how far the court might go to meet the objections of what he called the fastidious atheist. What would become of prayers in our legislative halls or the proclamations making Thanksgiving Day a holiday, he asked. These and all other references to the Almighty that run through our laws, our public rituals, our ceremonies, Douglas warned, might fall prey to the persnickety secularist. "We are a religious people," he summarily concluded, "whose institutions presuppose a supreme being." No matter the judicial affirmations of neutrality, the fastidious atheists, even when victorious in the courtroom, often remained engulfed in hostility in a nation that overwhelmingly presupposed God. The lived experience of these mid-century plaintiffs suggests how hard it was to uphold irreligious freedom even after the equal liberty and citizenship of atheists had been asserted by the nation's highest court. The how far freedom has come story, with the culminating legal victories of nonbelievers such as Vashti McCollum in 1948, is helpfully rescripted through closer examination of what it was like to be one of these plaintiffs at the very time the principle of neutrality was ascendant. With the Supreme Court newly open to Establishment Clause challenges of Christianity's favored status, litigation grew increasingly pivotal to secularist activism from the mid-1940s on. "Sue the Bastards" became the rallying cry of Madalyn Murray O'Hair and her organization, American Atheists. And that group created its own legal fund and in-house counsel to file sundry lawsuits in the decades following O'Hair's initial challenge to religion in Baltimore public schools, which she launched in 1959. O'Hair labeled these activities an exercise in litigious education. Even when American Atheists lost, each court fight provided her organization an opportunity to lecture the public about the principle of church-state separation. Lifted up by the media as headline-grabbing provocateurs, atheist plaintiffs came to be seen as dauntless protagonists inside secularist ranks and godless militants beyond those circles. They became convenient Cold War emblems of the joint threats of secularism and communism to the nation's religious character. O'Hair was the most vociferous, litigious, and despised, but none of these fastidious atheists got off easily. Lawrence Roth, a Jewish atheist plaintiff in the Ingalls school prayer case, had his home picketed and received death threats. A cross of gasoline-drenched rags was burned in his driveway by a group of teenagers who went unprosecuted. Arthur Cromwell, founder of the local Society of Freethinkers in Rochester, New York, was another among the high-profile petitioners who repeatedly challenged religious programs and activities in the public schools. Typical of the ire he provoked was a letter he received in 1951 about a threatened lawsuit against a Christmas pageant in an area high school. So here's the letter. "You had better get down on your knees and thank God that the people here in America allow you and others like you to live." This self-identified 100% American and Christian urge. "You ought to be shipped over to Russia where you belong. Thank God your funds are running low, and I hope they run so low that you and your family starve to death. That would be a better death than you deserve. I am sure God has no place in heaven for such a thing as you are, wishing you all the tortures of hell, and hoping you lose your mind and end up in the state institution and get the worst kind of treatment." Cromwell's compensation for all the antipathy he provoked as a devoted atheist was the modest celebrity it earned him in secularist ranks. Journals like Progressive World and American Rationalist sang his praises. He was lionized at an annual convention of freethinkers in St. Louis in 1961. Mostly, though, he was pictured as a godless crank and communist tool inimical to the nation's welfare. And here you have a picture of him in the newspaper. He's wagging his fingers, holding his Bible. Describes him as this atheist who has declared that the story of Adam and Eve is pure superstition or something like that. Cromwell would have remained primarily a local combatant, but for his free-thinking daughter, Vashti McCollum, the successful litigant against a release time program for religious instruction in Champaign, Illinois. Release time programs became popular in the 1910s and 1920s as a way that you could keep religion in the public schools, but try to diffuse some of the sectarian rivalries or interreligious rivalries in the public schools. So Catholics objected to Protestant forms of Bible reading, Protestants objected to Catholic forms, or Jewish students felt marginalized by these Christian practices. You could have these release time programs where Protestants, Catholics, and Jews could have their own kind of religious instruction, and that was seen as a way of keeping religion in the schools, but allowing particular religious groups to take the lead in those programs. They became very popular by the 1940s. And actually, McCollum is one of the ones challenging those programs. The fact that McCollum's case wound its way to the Supreme Court and that she prevailed elevated the attention given her father's efforts, even as her own notoriety and consequence quickly surpassed his. The hate mail she received pouring in from around the country was as voluminous as it was venomous. One letter writer enclosed a newspaper clipping of her picture disfigured with devil's horns and a tail, along with the scrawled assurance, "God will find a way to overcome the devil's work." This is another one. This is not that one, but here she's been drawn in red, little devil's horns up there. Another correspondent said, "You are a disgrace to our nation and should be driven out of this country at once." Still another accused the conventionally monogamous McCollum of loose sexuality and suggested a violent remedy. "You probably had your child before you were married. If you are married, what you need is someone to beat the hell out of you." The bullying of her son Jim, whose refusal to participate in the release time program had triggered the whole case, became so intense that McCollum and her husband felt compelled to withdraw him from the Champaign schools. They sent him to live with his grandparents in Rochester, where he enrolled in a private school and a safe remove from the immediate conflict. McCollum lost her part-time job at the University of Illinois, and her husband's appointment as a professor of horticulture was threatened as well. While she won significant allies among civil liberties activists and Unitarians, she and her family were nonetheless ostracized, maligned, and menaced with an intensity that made her court victory look quite limited in effect. She successfully challenged one release time program, but the community's majority continued to elevate religion above irreligion, with only modest relief for the minority standing of McCollum's humanistic secularism. There are a couple of other cartoons I found in her papers. This is a cartoon of the Christian faith and communism. Communism is leading atheism, the blind leading the blind. This other one is about atheistic professors. Is that one? Is it clear? Yeah. Bad pictures from the archives. Can't imagine how it grew here. And this atheistic professor has a watering can of secularism, and he's watering the anti-religious seed. And you get a sense that her success does not change the cultural milieu in which she's operating, in which these kinds of assumptions about the relationship between communism and atheism, or between atheistic college professors and irreligion, reign. McCollum had the satisfaction of the Supreme Court's vindication, which launched her to modest celebrity. She published a memoir called One Woman's Fight and became a recognized standard bearer among liberal activists. Most atheist plaintiffs, though, had far less to show for their contrarian showdowns with state and local officials. The story of Gary and Mary DeYoung, a pair of Delaware atheists, is worth dwelling on in that regard. Bid players by comparison to headliners like McCollum and O'Hare, the DeYoungs were tenacious church-state separationists in the 1960s and 1970s. Their atheistic preoccupations and litigious predilections, Gary's especially, made a mess of their lives. And they left an archive that amply demonstrates the instability that was the consequence of their free-thinking activism. 25 unprocessed boxes sitting in the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin. And when I say unprocessed, I mean really unprocessed, still in the taped shipping boxes in which they came to the archive. Fastidious atheists like the DeYoungs were certainly having their day in court, winning crucial victories about prayer and Bible reading in the public schools, about the rights of atheists to hold offices of public trust, as well as to claim a humanistic ground for conscientious objection. The principle of neutrality, that impartiality was to govern the state's treatment of believers and not non-believers, had come to enjoy, at least for a time, a constitutional consensus. Yet so much went wrong for Mary and Gary DeYoung as they pursued their ardent secularism on the margins of communities from Delaware to Minnesota to Iowa to Texas to Kansas. That's a picture of the DeYoungs there. The DeYoungs wanted to get religion out of the Delaware public schools, much like the McCollums in Illinois, the Murrays in Maryland, and the Schmidts in Pennsylvania. Gary especially had been raised for a life of fractious unbelief. His father, a poultry farmer in New Jersey, was a socialist who had left behind his Dutch Reformed faith and embraced the free-thinking iconoclasm of Emmanuel Haldeman Julius, prolific publisher of irreligious literature based in Girard, Kansas, famous for these little blue books. The family's finances, particularly during the Great Depression, had been precarious. Gary recalled his father renting out the family home and moving them all into one of his chicken coops. But he also remembered socialist luminaries like Norman Thomas and Scott Nearing visiting the small farm and picnicking with them. All told, he recollected a youth of painful peculiarity, on the outs with the wider community over religion, politics, and socioeconomic status. Finishing high school and unable to afford college, he enlisted in the United States Army, earned 6 Bronze Stars during World War II, and re-enlisted thereafter. Shortly after the war, he learned of another social marker of marginality for his family. His father had a half-brother who was black. Having an uncle of color brought racial discrimination to sharp focus for DeYoung, an awareness that was only heightened when he decided he wanted to attend Delaware State, which until 1947 had been known as the State College for Colored Students. Despite white segregationist objections, DeYoung managed to enroll there and became the school's first white graduate in 1956. His years at Delaware State in the mid-1950s effectively educated him in civil rights activism as he eagerly joined in protests to desegregate local restaurants and theaters. Fighting injustice and discrimination, he saw clearly, required direct involvement on his part, not simply, as he said, vicarious experiences of outrage. Brotherhood, he wrote at the head of one of his poems in 1964, is really the act of keeping your head on the chopping block until every human being can walk in freedom and dignity. Mary DeYoung, a teacher in the Delaware public schools, was keenly aware, along with her husband, of the growing agitation over prayer and Bible reading in the classroom. The Supreme Court cases of 1962 and 1963 that had declared both practices unconstitutional seemed right on target to the DeYoungs, both of whom were non-believers and were raising their children that way. The unison recitation of the Lord's Prayer and the reading of at least 5 verses from the King James Bible were required at the opening of each day in Delaware's public schools, and students were instructed to assume a reverential attitude when performing both. The state's Attorney General, David Buxton, had been openly critical of the Supreme Court decisions against such practices and had no interest in enforcing the rulings. These are some of the most unpopular Supreme Court decisions. 85% of Americans in a Gallup poll after the Supreme Court ruling against school prayer in 1964 opposed the decision. It was not surprising that the Attorney General in Delaware was on record against it. He had his eyes on the governorship. But in any case, the DeYoungs, along with the liberal Protestant family, had stepped forward with the backing of the American Civil Liberties Union to challenge the state's continued allowance of these ceremonies. The Third U.S. District Court sided with the plaintiffs and required compliance with the Ingle and Schmidt decisions. Much to Attorney General Buxton's chagrin, Delaware had been forced, in his view, to ignore God in its public schools and endorse this disturbing secularist trend in American public life. I believe it is a religious country, Buxton told reporters, and he brought in Episcopal Bishop James A. Pike to corroborate his stance in the case. Reciting the Lord's Prayer and reading the Bible, Pike explained on television with Buxton at his side, were non-sectarian gestures, basic to what it meant to be part of the Judeo-Christian culture. The DeYoungs in this initial battle had been relatively careful in their public statements. They both rejected the atheist label and claimed the gentler one of agnostic. Gary emphasized that he thought knowledge of the Bible was an important feature of the children's cultural education, cultural Bible, and that he simply opposed compulsory devotional reading in the public schools. Mary, for her part, said she would keep performing these religious practices in her classroom as required until the 3-judge panel ruled on their constitutionality. Those gestures did not help him much in swaying local opinion, which Buxton was effectively channeling. If you don't like the way the school is run in the U.S., one man wrote Mary from Wilmington, why don't you go to Russia? You can teach fine over there, and you don't have to read the Bible there. That is the place for all your kind of people. Popular scorn, though, was the only part of the price the DeYoungs paid for their litigiousness. Mary, untenured, lost her teaching job. Few parents were willing to expose their second graders to her unbelief, and members of the Middletown School Board had made it plain that they wanted to get rid of her for taking part in the lawsuit. Gary, having refashioned himself in his late 30s as a poet of the open road, had already been patching jobs together in haphazard ways, raising bees, selling encyclopedias, and hawking his self-published verse. His latest collection of poems, journalists noted with lurid glee, was called Sex, Church, and the Jungle. Gary lacked, to say the least, anything like job security. Me and my family, he wrote later, were reduced to destitution as a result of the blacklisting and job loss resulting from this lawsuit. Despite their legal vindication, the case had damaged the DeYoungs financially and exhausted them emotionally. They were keenly aware now of being a family of outsiders in Middletown, an unwanted minority at odds with most of their neighbors. So, within the year, the DeYoungs left Delaware for a fresh start in Minnesota, first moving to Cass Lake and then to Duluth, where Mary got a job as a caseworker in the county welfare department. Here he remained as eccentric and underemployed as ever, prone to exaggerating his educational and artistic accomplishments, picking up odd jobs now and again, and then opening a free-thought bookshop in a converted storefront in the family's Duluth home in 1967. He stocked his shelves with a range of anti-clerical literature from Tom Paine to Robert Ingersoll, while also continuing to vend his own poetry. Inside the store, he kept a large plywood sign with a black inscription reading, "Help stamp out atheists," which someone had deposited on his lawn and which DeYoung saved as indicative of typical Christian tactics to intimidate him. Since leaving Delaware, he had become all the more aggressive in his irreligious posture. He delighted in the atheist mantle and had picked up some of O'Hare's flair for conflict. A thoroughgoing secularist, he was ready to object to everything, from Sunday closing laws to the phrase "under God" and the Pledge of Allegiance. Undeterred by the opposition they had faced in Delaware, the DeYoungs complained in late 1967 about elements of sectarian religious indoctrination that they detected in Duluth's public schools. They saw this as particularly evident in a lunchtime grace and the annual Christmas programming. Their protest had the desired effect. The daily blessing broadcast over the high school's public address system was suspended, and their children's elementary school dropped a number of religious hymns from its holiday celebration. To say the least, this other image, I forgot to explain. They published stuff like this. They were always they published a lot of things about how they were raising their children in godless ways, and this is what their daughter, they published this, the DeYoung's youngest heretic or something. There is no God and I can prove it. Anyway, that's what that is. They have these kind of leaflets things they were publishing like this. Okay. To say the least, this challenge to this daily noontime blessing and to the Christmas program was controversial. And their challenge was met with considerable hostility. Their children were taunted and harassed. Gary's bookshop and the family's car were vandalized. A county commissioner speculated on a television news program that Mary, as an atheist, was unqualified to be a caseworker and should be fired. The city slapped housing code violations on the family's residents. They were deluged with hate mail, and the police warned them of bond threats to their home. Gary was understandably furious and raved now against the prejudice that he and his family faced as atheists. "I do not consider the religious community as anything but my enemy. I have been personally subjected to the rankest and vilest forms of discriminatory practice at the hands of religionists. Frankly, there is nothing to discuss. Just get the superstition out of the schools." Cooler heads urged careful review of the church-state issues, say how religious ideas and symbols might be studied in public schools as part of history, social studies, and the arts. But neither DeYoung nor his exasperated critics could muster that kind of dispassion as the controversy roiled the community. "He makes life so miserable for himself and his family," the pastor of First Lutheran Church lamented. "If there is no God, why should he fight so hard against him?" For his part, DeYoung had come to see such confrontations as a fundamental test of his secularist commitments. "The more you get knocked down," he said, "the more of a responsibility it becomes." The family, ostracized in Duluth, felt compelled to relocate again, this time to St. Paul, where Gary finally gave up on the notion that he would make a living as a poet and got a job with the Minnesota Highway Department, writing brochures and news releases. With the events in Duluth and Middletown weighing on him, Gary had come to see fighting discrimination against atheists more than emulating Whitman as his defining purpose, a cause that he increasingly couched in the language of civil rights activism. By 1971, he had incorporated the Church of Philosophical Materialism to minister to the needs of atheists, he said, along with the Minnesota Institute of Philosophy, that's the Minnesota Institute of Philosophy, a correspondence school that awarded PhDs and that better pedigreed rationalists disdained as a diploma mill. He seems to have had maybe 50 or 60 students, judging from these boxes of his curriculum and theses they were writing and classes they were taking. Already notorious in the state as an atheist meddler, DeYoung continued to call attention to prejudices large and small against nonbelievers. All the routine habits of civic theism he questioned, invocations at city council meetings, for example. When the master of a local Masonic lodge publicly reiterated the group's ban on atheists, along with the senile and insane, DeYoung denounced the statement as slanderous. So toxic had DeYoung's reputation become that even the Minnesota chapter of the ACLU wanted to avoid association with him when he tried to join them in a fight against state taxes aiding parochial schools. "We don't want any atheists as part of this," DeYoung recalled being told when he volunteered to help. "We definitely don't want you." Meanwhile, his job at the highway department started to unravel. The first year or two went smoothly enough, but then in the spring of 1971, he got involved in a civil rights case involving the firing of an African-American colleague. DeYoung saw the maneuvering that went into eliminating the man's job as rife with racial discrimination and protested the state officials. From then on, as DeYoung saw it, the work environment became increasingly hostile. His writing was nitpicked, his pieces rejected, his looks, he came to look like this, his looks, his long hair, his beard, his yellow socks, his sandals, all these things were criticized by his boss. Predictably, it was music at a Christmas party that provided the final flashpoint. He found the religious playlist offensive, as if the office holiday party was only for Christians, not Jews, Muslims, or secularists. When DeYoung interrupted the Christmas music with a recording of a recent pop song, his Roman Catholic supervisor saw the gesture as insubordinate and perverse. DeYoung described the song as having a humanist thrust, and he intended it, he said, as a symbolic expression of dissent. His boss was already scornful of DeYoung's moonlighting as an organizer of a church and a college for atheists, and his latest jab at Christmas cemented his view of DeYoung as a disruptive propagandist. DeYoung pointed out that his boss had no problem allowing the Little Sisters of the Poor to solicit funds on state premises while counting DeYoung's expression of his minority religious opinions as proselytizing. The conflict between Young and his supervisor predictably devolved from there. It ended in DeYoung's firing and an extended lawsuit over workplace discrimination. A little more than 2 years later, DeYoung briefly prevailed. With the Minnesota Human Rights Commission on his side, the highway department was ordered to pay him $12,000 in back wages for firing him, largely because he was an outspoken atheist. On appeal, however, the Minnesota Supreme Court upheld DeYoung's firing, saying it was on performance grounds, not because of his outspoken secularism. The mess at the highway department almost destroyed the couple's marriage. After years of enduring her husband's fitful employment and his unending battles, Mary had filed for divorce. Somehow, though, the DeYoungs persevered. Actually, in one place, DeYoung says they persevered because he found this Catholic priest who was unusually good at marriage therapy, which is ironic, but there you go. They decided to put the combined wreckage of Gary's dismissal, the resulting legal quagmire, and their own marital breakdown behind them by moving again, this time to Mercedes, Texas, where they spent 3 years. They kept up their old free-thinking habits. They continued to publish a journal called The Crucible, which they presented as the official organ of their atheistic ministry. They marked their opposition to Christian prayers at city council meetings, to blue laws, and to the distribution of Gideon Bibles in the public schools. There were some visible slights in Mercedes, but none with the drama of Middletown, Duluth, or St. Paul. Mary was hastily replaced by a Baptist minister on the local committee when her atheism became manifest in a column she wrote for the town's newspaper. Humiliation in Mercedes, was the headline the couple gave to the piece in the Crucible recounting her removal. Likewise, Gary's claim that he helped the new mayor in his election campaign earned a quick public denial and distancing. The mayor said, "I believe in God, I love God, I fear God, I am not an atheist." The mayor told the journalist to make it clear that he really hadn't been helped by Gary in his campaign, or at least he didn't share Gary's views. But these were tiny dust-ups compared to the controversies the couple had provoked elsewhere. By now, the DeYoungs were accustomed to a life of tenuous connection and vagrant movement from one place to the next. In March 1978, they moved to Hull, Iowa, drawn there by cheap housing afforded by an aged subscriber to their secularist mission. They were living primarily on a monthly disability pension of $447 from the VA, and as ever needed whatever financial help they could get. Hull, however, was an inauspicious place for an atheist family to land. In the northwest corner of the state with a strong Dutch Reformed heritage, it was a small community in which Protestant folkways securely prevailed. Prayer and Bible reading were still commonplace in the public schools there, and Mary immediately wrote a letter to the superintendent questioning the constitutionality of those practices. Knowing the negative outcome of any court fight, Hull school officials relented and stopped the classroom religious exercises. Soon the DeYoungs were in the news again. "Atheist Christians feud in Hull," proclaimed a headline in the Des Moines Register. "I don't know why Gary DeYoung would want to come here and disturb the peace and tranquility of a God-fearing people," Hull's mayor told a reporter. "He's like a fish out of water. He doesn't belong in this area." The couple's 15-year-old son, Charles Darwin DeYoung, they had another son named William James. But anyway, this is Charles Darwin. The couple's 15-year-old son, it's all true. Then a freshman in high school took much of the heat in this latest disturbance. He'd been taunted on the school bus, apparently, as a dirty atheist and provoked into misbehavior. He was suspended from the bus and then stopped going to school. The bus driver admitted that Charles and his younger brother had been harassed a lot, so much so that the driver had once admonished the other kids, "If you're really Christian, then what's with it with this hateful attitude toward these people?" The DeYoungs resorted to homeschooling the two boys and filed a protest with the Iowa Civil Rights Commission, claiming that their elder son's treatment by the school district was a form of religious discrimination. They got nowhere with this latest complaint, and Gary increasingly saw his second-class citizenship in evidence in every bureaucratic encounter he had in Hull. He found it almost impossible, he said, to survive in northwest Iowa when holding views at variance with the majority of the local population. One school teacher finally decided she wanted to help these misfits, writing the DeYoungs in June 1980. "Since you are not comfortable living here, I am willing to stick my neck out and help you move to more suitable surroundings." It was not long before the DeYoungs gave up on Hull and relocated to Spencer, Iowa, before landing in Stanley, Washington. Late in life, in the 1990s, the DeYoungs were trying to keep the predators at bay through a tree nursery in Stark, Kansas. The children were all long grown, so the couple no longer had to do battle with the public schools on their behalf, thankfully. Gary embraced the 19th century moniker of the village atheist. This is where I wish I knew about Gary when I was writing the book. This would have been a great epilogue. He embraced the moniker village atheist, emblematic of his lifetime of forlorn nonconformity at odds with local religious norms. This is a letter he wrote to George W. Bush when Bush was a candidate for president, complaining about Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan's astrology, in any case. He created some letterhead with this designation, suggesting that he was going to start a new publication with this title. But his health was poor and his frame of mind was increasingly bitter and conspiratorial. The idea never materialized. His old dream of sustaining an atheist church and university had run aground years ago. He felt forgotten and marginal, cheated of his due for his decades of sacrifice for the secularist cause. In 1993, at age 70, he managed one last manifesto of atheist grievance called Religion, the Disease. It bemoaned the exclusion of atheists by the Boy Scouts as well as by organizations like the VFW and the American Legion. But it took particular aim at a beekeepers association in Oklahoma that had refused him a program spot. They refused him a program spot because unless he would refrain from talking about religion. He had suffered through religious invocations and benedictions at a national convention of beekeepers in Kansas City. and he saw an urgent need to remind those in the trade of the warfare between science and religion. The religious right, in de Young's view, would substitute creationism for evolutionary science anywhere they could, even in the honey industry. The self-published book had no circulation. It was a rant of an old crank whose spleen at everything from Bill Clinton's philandering to Rush Limbaugh's bombast had become boundless. When an editor of a free thought journal asked him for a review copy, de Young felt too strapped for resources to send one. Please keep in mind that I have been on the very front line in fighting these atheist battles in the most difficult forum of all, the courts, he explained. And it has not been easy at all. The stresses of these lawsuits resulting in 6 bypasses and financial ruin. His gloom did not seem overblown, but a realistic assessment of how much his fastidious atheism had cost him and his family. What had the ascendant principle of neutrality been worth to the de Youngs over the course of their highly litigious lives? With the Engel and Schmidt decisions on their side, they pursued successful challenges to religious practices in the public schools of Middletown, Duluth, and Hull. When it came to prayer, Bible reading, and Christmas programs in the public schools, a non-believing minority was able to compel the believing majority to recognize its secularist demands. Those were substantial victories. Yet when those wins are seen against the wider backdrop of the hardships the de Youngs faced, they look rather wan. Gary and Mary both lost jobs in large part because of their godless stands. Their children endured considerable grief as troublemaking atheists and suffered from the financial insecurity of their parents. Public officials treated the family as nuisances, if not pariahs. They were forced into a marginal, vagrant existence, often with quite meager resources for sustaining themselves. Gary was, to be sure, a disagreeable soul who only got more acerbic and litigious as the years went by, who was often his own worst enemy. He had an enormous chip on his shoulder. Privation and ill health only made it bigger. He launched protest runs for public office that looked delusional. He could not understand why elite PhD programs would not admit him. He was, by the end of his life, an ill-tempered curmudgeon as much as a principled activist. Whatever Gary's flaws, though, they do not obviate the conclusion that the playing field remained quite slanted against non-believers. The winning cases of plaintiffs such as Vashti McCollum were important vindications, but the promise of equal rights and liberties for atheists remained hard to realize in practice. Affirmations of neutrality, that the state was to ensure that the irreligious enjoyed the same freedoms and protections as the religious, sounded impressive in the abstract, but were far muddier in application. The lived experience of exacting atheists like the de Youngs made the breadth of that gap quite apparent. They were often still treated like Locke's wild beasts, dangerous to civil society who had to be contained. Toleration of them was grudging at best. What is freedom of religion? The freethinker Miriam Allen de Ford had asked in 1947 in the pages of Progressive World, a monthly favored by the de Youngs and other activists in these circles. The American system still seemed, in de Ford's view, governed by the old Lockean premise. You choose the manner in which you worship a god and the style in which you address him, but worship some sort of god you must, she wrote. Freedom of religion, she suggested, meant little without corresponding liberty for those who wanted freedom from religion. The close entwining of faith and citizenship that de Ford lamented was only heightened as the Cold War intensified, but she also wrote on the front edge of the Supreme Court's sustained reconsideration of Jefferson's wall. 1947 was the year that Justice Hugo Black vigorously asserted his views on the importance of closely monitoring violations of the Establishment Clause in his majority opinion in Everson v. Board of Education. All citizens, whether Catholics, Lutherans, Mohammedans, Baptists, Jews, Methodists, non-believers, Presbyterians, or the members of any other faith in Black's listing, were to share equally in the rights and liberties of the First Amendment. The state should be studiously neutral in its relations with religious believers and non-believers, he argued. Plaintiffs like Vashti McCollum, Roy Turcaso, Madeline Murray, and Edward Schmidt depended on that proposition, as did the de Youngs. But their trust in how far Black's reasoning would reach was only partially rewarded. Secularists won some, but lost more as the suits piled up in the long wake of the Supreme Court's reappraisal of the Establishment Clause. The wins that secularists chalked up were generally of two types. First, there were those that built on the Engel decision, banning prayers from the public schools. A case in Chandler, Arizona in 1981, for example, successfully challenged prayers at high school commencements, a position that was then confirmed in Lee v. Wiseman by the Supreme Court in 1992. Second, there were those that built on the Torcasa decision, overruling Maryland's constitutional requirement of belief in God for those holding offices of public trust. Maryland's constitution was one that had this, that required public office holders to profess a belief in God. And Torcasa wanted to be a public notary. He sued in Maryland and eventually was vindicated at the Supreme Court level. And this played itself out. As late as in 1990, South Carolina, the governor in South Carolina and several state officials in South Carolina wanted to keep this atheist mathematics professor named Herb Silverman from becoming a notary public in South Carolina. They eventually dropped their efforts to keep him from becoming a notary public, and he became a notary public. They would have lost if they prosecuted this, but they were trying to keep it from happening. But that's a case where the constitutional consensus is just in place that you can't keep an atheist from holding an office of public trust like being a notary public. Okay. The areas in which the free-thinking plaintiffs consistently lost, though, were more numerous. Challenges to tax exemptions for church property, to prayers opening city council meetings and sessions of Congress, and to ceremonial theistic expressions, such as in God we trust on currency. After 4+ decades of litigation, fastidious atheists were left well short of the clarity they sought in their legal campaigns for thorough disestablishment. Employment discrimination cases like the ones that the DeYoungs lost were another type that often did not go well. Let's give you one more example. This is a math teacher, Bruce Hunter, who had a long-running battle with the Dallas Independent School District in the 1970s. Hunter had been teaching in the district for well over a decade and had become a recognized leader of several successful math and science programs at Bryan Adams High School. When a Canadian evangelist was invited to speak at the school in October 1970, ostensibly about the prevention of drug abuse, several teachers objected to his revival-type preaching at a school assembly. Hunter took the lead in an effort to pass a resolution against combining Christian evangelism with school assembly programs. The proposed resolution was tabled for fear of sparking a community backlash against the teachers involved, but word got out all the same. Hunter was singled out as the one pushing for removing sectarian religious viewpoints from the Dallas schools. In this occasion, the principal to warn him, "I've gotten parents and students coming to me asking me to kick you out." That initial controversy died down, but rumors lingered that Hunter was an atheist. The next flashpoint came in 1972 when a student asked him what he thought of the "under God" phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, and Hunter admitted that he was opposed to it, which caused the gossip to intensify and cemented his reputation as the atheist teacher. At that point, some parents began requesting that their children be transferred out of his classes, and the principal obliged their qualms. The situation gradually worsened from there. By 1974, the principal had joined arms with the PTA to force Hunter's transfer to another high school, where the new principal saw it as his mission to bring people to Christ, openly promoting evangelical groups such as Young Life and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in school assemblies. The new principal perceived Hunter's objections to his efforts to cultivate a positive Christian ethos at the school as insubordinate, as failing to be a team player. How could Hunter object to programming promoting Christian service and warning of the moral dangers of godlessness? And those dangers included adultery, drunkenness, dishonesty, and drugs. Meanwhile, parents were again requesting transfers, and some of the students had begun calling him out as an atheist queer and atheist weirdo, among other choice expressions. The principal found cause to place Hunter on probation in 1975 and then terminate him in 1976. Filing suit against the district for religious discrimination, Hunter sought reinstatement and back pay, but lost in the district court and on appeal. The court accepted the performance rationales the principal had cited and dismissed religion as a motivating factor. Hunter clearly had found no relief from his quandary through claiming Title VII protections against employment discrimination or through invoking Black's principle of neutrality. The Supreme Court's constitutional readings of the Establishment Clause failed to guide the practices of school administrators, to protect Hunter from censor and termination, or to place non-belief on anything like equal footing with belief in the Dallas public schools. The situation has not gotten much clearer since plaintiffs like Hunt and the DeYoungs waged their battles. Justices William Rehnquist and Antonin Scalia, hoping to whittle down Black's church-state legacy, launched sharp attacks on what Scalia termed the supposed principle of neutrality between religion and irreligion, forcefully calling into question the wall of separation views that the court had advanced in the mid-20th century. Scalia defended a common ground monotheism as the nation's shared inheritance, one that the state had long endorsed and should not abandon. As he wrote in the 2005 dissent, with respect to public acknowledgement of religious belief, it is entirely clear from our nation's historical practices that the Establishment Clause permits the disregard of devout atheists. Both the nation's religious history and its original political framing were, and Scalia argued, on the side of the God-affirming against the God-denying. On this counter-reading, the challenges posed by fastidious atheists from McCullen to more recent agitators like the California litigant Michael Newdow simply do not need to be taken seriously. The nation's ceremonial deism is a given of the American polity. The very pursuit of neutrality, so the counter-argument goes, is little more than a subterfuge that masks secularist hostility toward religion. Seen as a belated innovation in First Amendment jurisprudence, the principle should be set aside as an aggressive assault on the country's religious moorings. Much of the contemporary landscape for atheist plaintiffs would remain quite familiar to the free-thinking activists of the post-war era. Recent conflicts over the Pledge of Allegiance and the Boy Scouts would be all too familiar. So would questions about the treatment of atheists in the military, including the question of recognizing non-theistic chaplains. With 3 sons following his footsteps into the military, it had always rankled Gary DeYoung that their dog tags did not specify their religious identity as atheist, and that there were no atheist chaplains to provide them support. There are atheists in foxholes, he insisted, but they hardly dared to open their yaps about it. Familiar, too, would be the old fights over religion in the public schools. The case of Jessica Alquist, a 16-year-old high school student in Rhode Island, makes that plain. In 2011, she challenged a religious display on the wall of her school's auditorium, an 8-foot-high prayer banner that invoked our Heavenly Father for moral strength and character. That's the banner. Placed in the auditorium in 1963, it was intended as a direct reproach to the Supreme Court's rulings removing prayer and Bible reading from the public schools. It was put up in 1963 to make plain the opposition to the rulings. Though baptized Catholic, Alquist had come to see herself as a convinced atheist and found the prayer exclusionary. It seemed like it was saying every time I saw it, you don't belong here. With the help of the ACLU, Alquist filed a lawsuit to have the exhibited prayer taken down. Much as it had been the case with the McCollums or the DeYoungs, that legal challenge immediately made Alquist the object of hate-filled threats as a scourge to God and country. When a federal judge decided the case in Alquist's favor in January 2012, her own state representative denounced her on talk radio as an evil little thing. It all sounded so strangely overheated and yet also utterly familiar. Alquist had become a fastidious atheist. Arthur Cromwell, Vashti McCollum, Lawrence Roth, Madeline Murray, Edward Shemp, Gary and Mary DeYoung, Bruce Hunter, Ishmael Jaffery, any of them could have written this latest schoolhouse script. In theory, over the last several decades, atheists have been accorded equal rights, liberties, and protections. They were officially tolerable. In practice, irreligious freedom remained an enduring conundrum for a nation resolutely under God.
You'll take questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll start, we can open the floor to your questions, if people have questions. Yeah, what?
So wonderful talk. Thank you very much. My question is, how is atheism in America related to kind of atheism outside of America? And I ask because, when you think of early anti-irreligion rhetoric, like what you started out with, it's going on at the same time that missionaries are accusing entire nations of atheism, and or other writers are portraying Persia and China as examples of civilizations without religion, right? But then when we get to the bulk of your talk, aside from references to communism, it always seems like atheism is in this embrace with mainstream American religion, and it's always the rhetoric of atheism seems to point to Europe and America and only the same ethnic groups as the believers even. And so rather than connect its possible kind of historical or global religious alternatives to theism. And I'm just wondering, why is that?
Right. Yeah, that is one of the things you notice in the 18th century literature, certainly in 19th century literature. There's all this speculation about whether whether a certain nation is atheistic or not. So and a lot of the times the argument is it's not possible to have a nation of atheists, and then you'll come along and either the free-thinking types will claim that it is possible, and this is the nation that suggests it's possible, or they'll say the missionary evidence supports that. So there is a kind of global perspective on all of this, and I think you're right. I mean, there is something about this American variety of this that does kind of narrow in on itself and get consumed in these battles in American law, right? So, I found that by the end of the 19th century, this is a tradition that really thinks about itself as having a distinct American lineage. I mean, Paine is a cosmopolitan figure, but he's kind of a singular saint. I mean, they all are just lionizing Paine. And then Ingersoll. And they just don't have too much of a cosmopolitan sensibility about this. I mean, they don't talk about Nietzsche very much. They don't have a sense of Russian anarchists or something. I mean, a little bit, but it really is kind of inward looking in that way, and it becomes it does seem to me that it's formed, especially in a struggle with evangelical Protestantism. That's what it seems to be, and a lot of this is very local, on the ground battles. I mean, it's like Gary and Mary DeYoung. I mean, they're in these local communities, and they end up really battling, especially with Protestants, sometimes with Catholics. But in the late 19th century, they're really battling with Protestants. It becomes these little local showdowns, so you're right. Occasionally they reach their eyes a little bit higher, and there's conversation. Some of their bigger orators do crisscross the Atlantic, or even the Pacific. I mean, some of them go to New Zealand and Australia and things like that. But not. You're right. There is an insularity to it, and I think it has a lot to do with this the peculiarities of them forging their identity in particular contest with these evangelicals. That's what it feels like. Yes.
Sort of a follow-up a little bit to that question. Why do you think that the the hostility, the passionate and tenacious hostility towards atheism has persisted in America, whereas in Europe, in Western Europe, it's recently, it's not just tolerated, but people are proud to say that they're atheists in France and in England.
Right. Yeah. No, the American hostility is relatively unusual. I mean, this is true that you still have the polling data. This is a group that is one of the least trusted. People are very unlikely to want to vote for an avowed atheist for political office. There's still large reservoirs of suspicion. I think, in this period with Gary and Mary DeYoung and Vashti McClellan and all of this, it has all these Cold War resonances. That's what's especially driving it in this period. The question is why it persists, after the Cold War. Why it has remained strong. I think it's attenuated to some degree. I mean, that's what you see with the popularity of the new atheists, the ability of so many Americans now to just simply tell a pollster that they have no religious identity. They feel comfortable doing that, and that's the demographic that seems to really be growing over the last 2 decades, going up to about 25%, and it's especially high among millennials. So I think it's wearing off a little bit, but it is still unusually high by comparison to to Europe.
And any answer to the why that might be?
Well, I mean, that goes into this larger question of why Americans have remained so much more religious. I mean, and then that's the question. I mean, okay, so some of it is this kind of voluntaristic religious milieu that the United States creates and fosters, has generated really populist forms of Christianity, highly democratized, really open to charismatic leadership, and then it's kind of that constantly kind of regenerates these traditions, and as opposed to more state churches in Europe. So that free market model is one explanation, that there's something highly democratized in this American setting, and that's different. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be part of it. It's there is something just about the ways in which Christianity does become seen as kind of voluntary association with Christianity comes to be seen as essential to the maintaining of this democratic state. And the ways those two things line up and get lined up from the early 19th century, and that kind of sense, the argument goes to today's democratic republic without these vibrant voluntary religious institutions, by which they mean usually Protestant religious institutions. That is just a really strong political religious amalgam.
Can I offer a hypothesis?
Okay.
Just real quick on this topic. So the fastidiousness of the atheist seems to be particularly objectionable. So I wonder if it's, and the rise of the nuns, which seem to be unobjectionable, so that saying I don't have a view is not really a problem, but having a view.
Having a really strong view, right.
So what you mean, is it possible that in fact the issue is that the atheists are seen as the intolerant ones, and that everybody else is participating in a general culture of tolerance, and the only people who aren't actually being tolerant of anybody else are these fastidious, persnickety ones,
Right.
who can't bear other people's difference and therefore want to destroy it. So there's a funny way in which Christianity has become the kind of common, or kind of monotheism has become the common ground for American toleration.
Right.
I don't know if that's...
No, I think that is part of it. I mean, the atheists are seen in this case as being supremely intolerant of this free religious expression. So that it's not seen, they see it as establishment cases, that this is the establishing of Christianity, it's making Christianity the norm in these public institutions, in the public schools. And most of the times the Christians see it as a matter of the free exercise of religion. Like they're trying to impede people from wanting, pray when they just want to pray, and you should let them pray, right? And so the accommodationist position that emerges is that you do let people pray as long as you're not like having the school write the prayer, right? Or it's not being led by a school official. So it has become much more accommodationist in that kind of way. But that is the breakdown. The atheists are seen as trying to be coercive in their own way. They feel coerced, but on the other side, they feel like the atheist position is coercing this majority who just wants to let their children pray and read the Bible.
Right.
And so they argue, so that's how that breaks down. And then so that the principle of neutrality is seen from the other side as hostile to religious expression and the free exercise of religion. And so it's not neutrality, it's hostility. And that's where you get, that's the crux of the debate. I don't think it's a debate that's easy to resolve. Merits for the argument on actually on both sides.
In some ways, an observation following on this last discussion, part of what struck me about your talk was not just the tenacity and fastidiousness of the atheists, but the vigor of the anti-atheists.
Right.
And there's something in that vigor that goes beyond sort of the general acceptance of a vaguely religious kind of framework. And so there's a lot of energy behind the anti-atheist posture. And I wonder, I don't know how far I want to press this, but if it's not connected to a kind of anti-intellectualism in American culture, because there are real arguments going on the side of the atheists, and the believers sort of reach the end of what they can say at a certain point.
Right. I mean, definitely a lot of these free-thinking secularist atheists see it as exactly that way. I mean, In the battles in the 1920s, a revolution in the public schools, they see this as it's these, Tennessee bumpkins, or Arkansas, and so then it just can't face up to the genuine intellectual challenges that are out there to their account of creation or something. So yeah, there's definitely a strain in that. And I think you're right too. We remember. Yes, there is something fastidious and even intolerant about these atheists, but the venom that they're provoking, we have to linger on that, right? The Roths when challenging that Regent's prayer in New York, it's when they win, just all hell breaks loose for them, and for the other plaintiffs in that case, not all of them are atheists, right? There are a couple of Jewish plaintiffs in that case, a humanist plaintiff, an ethical culturist, and the atheist. Now the atheist gets the most venom directed at him, Lawrence Roth, but for all of them, hell breaks loose. And so, yeah, we have to I think linger over that. There are all these kinds of things, the intolerance, it's one thing to object to their position, it's quite another thing to try to run people out of town, which is really what's happening in a lot of these cases. These people can't live in those communities anymore.
Is the church-state question, I'm sort of interested. If one believes firmly in the division between church and state, does one sort of fall naturally into an atheist camp? I would assume not. Is there some space for people who might even be, Presbyterians or Catholics or whatever, who would still believe firmly in that division? But it would sound also as if these atheists were so firm in what they believe, they weren't reaching out to any sort of supports.
Right.
Or is that not the case?
No, it's true that they're not particularly good at alliance building, especially the Madeline Murrays, the DeYoungs. But I will say there are often either Jewish plaintiffs as well that are allied sometimes with them, or liberal Protestants, Unitarians often, but others. So that there are other supporters out there, and the lawyers will often see that those are the better plaintiffs. The reason a lot of people want the Schmidt case to go forward ahead of the Engel case because they think the Schmidt case, they have that not. If they're Unitarians, they're not maybe as Christian as they should be, but they're a nice family. They're holding their Bible, and they're worried more about Lawrence Roth and what that will signal, and they think that the Schmidts might make a better case. But they both go forward and they both win. But there's a lot of that. People trying to think through, whether put forward a liberal Protestant family, but find your Presbyterian family, and that'll be easier on the case. And a lot of the times, there's a lot of positioning. And McCollum's do a lot of this positioning. This is, as you can tell from her father, and this is a free-thinking atheistic family. And yet she's constantly trying to position herself as a kind of alliance with the Unitarians, as more humanistic, trying to soften the edges. And that's exactly, I think, the DeYoungs do that too. They try to soften the edges. Well, I'm an agnostic, I'm not an atheist, or, those kinds of things. So they're always trying to work on this as a kind of public image sort of way, so they can get a little more traction out there. It's really, doesn't usually work, but they're trying hard, and you can see what they're trying to do. And the posing with the Bible, that drove Madeline Murray crazy with the Schmidts posing with the Bible. She wanted to be purer than that, but for the Schmidts, they thought the Bible is like this protective symbol. If we pose with the Bible, maybe people won't hate us as much. We do have principles we're standing on here. John?
John,
I'm curious, is there any anthropological work on this that might be relevant? I'm struck by the fact that you could go through this entire thing about America and Europe was brought in, but not one mention of any non-Western culture. Can there be atheists among animists, for example? The vast part of the population of the world has never been much involved with God, as we would understand it. And indeed, the long history of evolution is one in which this is a completely irrelevant phenomenon. So is there some commentary provided by anthropologists or perhaps even psychologically oriented anthropologists that could throw light on the viciousness of this particular debate. That interests me.
Right. That might be able to reframe it. I mean, you'd be able to see it from a different. I mean, if you have other kind of cultural vantage points from which to think about the particular monotheistic qualities of this and this particular setting that makes it particularly vehement. I don't know of that work. I mean, Matthew Inglekey is an anthropologist who has turned his attention to British humanists, but when he works on, he did some ethnography elsewhere, and that, he just didn't bring atheism and humanism into view. So I haven't seen that kind of work. When I have seen these kind of comparative questions, it's like what Mark is saying. It's earlier on when people are trying to gather from this travel literature or the missionary literature whether anybody has actually come across a nation of atheists and what that would tell us, because they're really arguing about whether God is universally known out there in the world, that you've never encountered through a travel or a missionary journeys a people that doesn't have some sort of innate idea, some idea of God or gods. If there's this universal kind of recognition of that somehow becomes proof about God, because we've never found any people, any nation out there that doesn't believe in God. So they're kind of using an anthropology there to undergird their theological claims about God.
The issue is really not about God, it's about gods. In other words, wouldn't a lot of these problems be solved if we had a truly heterogeneous understanding of God? You ain't male and you ain't female.
Yeah, well, it might well help. I mean, unfortunately, that's not what we have. I mean, in these debates, it seems it's just so, it's been, right, the debates are so formed. I mean, even the very idea of atheism in some sense is, an idea especially that forms in these Christian circles as a weapon that you use against your opponents by arguing that if you adopt this theological posture, it will produce atheism. If you move to go into this deist position, that's just a stepping stone to atheism. So a lot of it is an internal polemic that within Christian debates. I mean, so that it is all wrapped up in that, and I don't think we might want to get outside of that, but I'm not sure, and that we don't seem to have the resources to do that at this point still. And I mean, we don't have the demographic profile still. We have way too many Christians and other monotheists. If that's the issue, to say, well, if we just have more animists, in the culture, we might be able to not have these debates the way we're having. But we don't have that. Is that? I don't know.
I have Eunice and then
I have a question actually about the peculiarity of American atheism and the way it unfolded in the U.S. So it seems like education and law are the two avenues all these contestation happen, and I was wondering why education figure prominently, and does it say anything about broader issues like imagination of public or imagination of youth, and about the law, since these are seems like most of these cases are individual complaints.
Right.
So I wonder, does this have any effect in terms of kind of creating a more individualistic culture of atheism in the U.S.?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, I do think we have a relatively individualistic culture of atheism. Now, there have been attempts to forge communities, humanist communities, or form communities around notions of the religion and humanity, and to create kind of secular versions. So there have been efforts, and you still see it. I mean, you still see kind of a new humanistic. Bart Campolo is one, Greg Epstein is another. These folks who want to build up humanist communities, and so they want to create a culture of non-belief that is not so individualistic, and not just kind of these this village atheist model, which is still the model that even though this is 2000, he's decided he's going to be still a village atheist. that's this kind of 19th century image of this isolated person surrounded by a bunch of religious people, but without okay, so he has a sense that he could found a church of atheism. He never really does that very well. And there's no actual Minnesota Institute of Philosophy where anybody's actually gathered. They're just like dispersed around the country by the end. So there's not much of a community on this. So it is very individualistic. There are more efforts that are trying to create communities. And the question is whether they can ever be successful. And there were already experiments in the 19th century trying to create communities. There was one in Missouri called Liberal, Missouri, where they tried to create basically a free-thinking town. And they wouldn't allow any churches in the town. They only wanted free-thinkers to live there. And it didn't go well. I mean, it lasted a while. But eventually the Methodists got the Hall of Mental Freedom or whatever and put it into the church. And so Liberal, Missouri is still on the map. It's probably not very liberal. It's down in the southwest corner of the state. Silverton, Oregon is another one. So they have had them, but you're right. It's mostly this kind of lone village blasphemer image, and I still think that's what Gary DeYoung was living with, and Mary, in many ways, were living with. That's the kind of eccentric individuality that the posture generates and almost relies on. Okay, as for education, there's so this is. Again, Americans from the 19th century are highly invested in creating a fusion of religion in the public schools. Now, the problem is that it also creates incredible divisions. By the 1830s and 40s, there's already massive divisions between Protestants, Catholics over religion in the public schools. So by the 1860s, there's this big case in Cincinnati. It's called the Bible War in Cincinnati, where they finally decide there's so much conflict between Protestants and Catholics over what kind of religion they'll be in the public schools. The school board decides that neutrality is the best approach. We should just not try to do either Protestant or Catholic things in the public schools. And that outrages the Protestants because, and the Catholics aren't too happy about it since the Protestants were kind of in the majority. They saw they had more to gain. So there was those battles, and then let's just keep going. That religious release time program is also kind of an outgrowth of that. Same sort of thing. How can we keep religion in the public schools and assuage these religious differences that keep intruding themselves in the schools? So there's just this desire by the middle decades of the 20th century, this sense that you have to have religion in the public schools as a way of holding juvenile delinquency at bay. You're just going. There's this sort of it centers youth morally, builds their character like this prayer, right? To have these kinds of practices in the schools. So there's a heavy investment in it. And that's, why these decisions are, that's one of the reasons why these decisions are so controversial, because people are invested in the kind of moral character building of those practices. They're also heavily invested in it because America is a Christian nation, a religious nation, and then the communists are godless.
So this is a kind of Sheehan-like hypothesis to throw out. It follows directly on these last two comments, and trying to speak to the vehemence of the anti-atheism and the like, and the challenges of education. And I think it's this, that it's essential to the American constitutional bargain that if religion is going to appear in the public sphere, and the schools are an excellent example of this, but also lots of other places, then on some level, religious people have to, as you just said, compromise their truth claims, right? You just can't force, say, a Catholic version into the schools because the Protestants will object, or vice versa.
Right.
And I think some of the hostility towards the atheism is that they don't have to compromise, right? These fastidious people are coming forward and they're absolutists, right? And they're absolutists who actually have the Constitution on their side.
Yeah,
right, but when they're coming up again, and to me, the constant comment of go to Russia, that's where you belong, right,
right,
is in some ways a kind of expression of exactly that. There's this, and we're stuck with it, this weird quality of religious expression in the public sphere in a country that's very religious but also very diverse means that no one can ever be right. in the way that none of these religions really want to give up their truth claims. Right? And so the only people who actually don't have to compromise in that way are the atheists.
Yeah, and that becomes part of the critique, that basically with these decisions, the non-believers win, the secularists win, and now their religion
Yes.
is the religion in the public schools, right? Because it's seen that the secularists don't think they have a religion, but that's what the counter-argument says. It's like, okay, now it's no longer Catholic, it's no longer Protestant. There's none of this kind of there's none of this religious release time program. So now they're just utterly neutral and empty and secular, and that is the atheist religion. And so now you've let them put, this is the claim. I hear you shaking your head, but this is the claim that somehow secular humanism becomes the established religion in the schools, and that then is a big part by the 1980s still the Reagan and the religious right critique about what has happened. And why they can mobilize so strongly against secular humanism because they believe that's the religion that now is getting preferential treatment. And so that is one of the big leverage points. Yes.
I was shaking my head, and why not just instead of referring to that as secular humanism, which suggests an inclusiveness among the atheists in this case, just call it rational skepticism, and let people just say, well, let's let our ideas compete with evidence, and leave it at that.
Right.
If you want to believe what you can't prove to me, I'm certainly not going to stop you from doing it.
Right.
But if you want to have a conversation with me, then I would hope we would all follow reasonable discussion rules about providing evidence.
Right. So that's right. So if we called it rational skepticism instead of secular humanism, and we made that the norm, it would be the same kind of objection about what the norms are in the public schools, and that carries even lately a kind of religious context. That's what the debate would go from there. I happen to think the only a really workable solution in this is some kind of neutrality. Really, at the end of the day, and we really probably we can't buy into this argument that somehow there is a kind of religion of secularism that is taking over instead.
Well, it might make sense as well for those who would care to be called these rational skeptics to agree that there are a lot of common ethical points that we can agree upon. I have no problem with taking the wrapper off most of the words.
Right.
Get rid of the Heavenly Father and the Amen.
Right.
And,
there's nothing to
all pretty much agree with that.
Right. Exactly. That's the thing is that also this is pointed out by a lot of seriously religious people is that the kind of prayers you get in the public schools when you go down this path are so innocuous and vapid, right? That it's better not to have them, right? You better have space for prayer where you can have religiously specific things to say that are true to a particular tradition, and just find those spaces. Don't create governance, versions of prayer. Now this one, right? So if you took that off, you could see this as, fine, right? Who's going to object to fair play or being good sports?
And I read through it. It looks pretty acceptable.
Right. It seems pretty acceptable. They'll accept the Dear Heavenly Father and school prayer, and when that it was put there in 1963, the thumb their nose at the Supreme Court. You find out the context here is, so then you start, maybe Jessica Alquist has a point. But, right. The prayer case in 1962 is a New York case, the one that Lawrence Roth and Stephen Engel and others are objecting to, and that is a prayer that has been written by a committee. It's a 22-word prayer written by a group of rabbis, priests, and ministers, because that's how we imagine religious pluralism. We get Protestants, Catholics, and Jews together, and we write a 22-word prayer. And the critics of it is that it's just vapid. It's just that this is prayer, then we really reduced prayer to something really inconsequential.
Well, why should it even be a prayer at that point rather than just a guide to good living?
Right, okay, it could be that.
Because if it's a prayer, then you're invoking a higher power.
Right. I'm not defending. I'm just saying that that's part of the argument there is like that is that you get to that point and you read the prayer and you go, yeah, there's not a lot that's objectionable here, but it's also kind of reducing prayer to something really rather hollow and empty. And it's the same kind of problem I think that seriously religious people have with the way the Supreme Court justifies nativity scenes on public parks. And that is that they're basically saying the nativity scene has cultural significance. You look at this and it's a statement about the importance of family or something. And it's surrounded by reindeer and candy canes and Santa Claus, and so therefore it's just it's a cultural pastiche. Well, that's great. So now this, Pawtucket, Rhode Island can have their nativity scene because it's just this cultural pastiche. But on the other hand, if you're a serious Christian, you've just reduced the nativity scene to a kind of like cultural pastiche. So I think that's the, that becomes part of the problem too. Is the, once you find a way to justify these kinds of things like prayer and nativity scenes, it's often on such thin terms. Really, or it just becomes like the ceremonial theism stuff that the Supreme Court says is just fine. Well, fine, but it's not very. It's pretty thin at the end of the day. So,
I have you, sir.
As I listen to your accounts of these, not merely fastidious atheists, but activist fastidious atheists, I contrast that with my experience in life as an agnostic and maybe a fastidious agnostic, but not an activist one.
right.
And on the one hand, I feel lots of minor slaps in everyday life when I encounter some sort of public statement about God, but it's had very little effect on my life. So what I'm wondering is if you have any thoughts about how these activists compare or relate to the what I think would be the great majority of atheists and agnostics who are not activist in this way. The other related comparison I make is I realize that for the civil rights movement, people were compelled by Jim Crow, which affected them deeply in their everyday life. But as an agnostic, at least living in Berkeley, I don't have Jim Crow in my
Right.
life. It's a much less significant interference.
Right. Yeah. I think, and this is one. I find this a little bit fascinating in Gary DeYoung's story. The way in which he sees him as a civil rights activist, and he connects it in with his experiences at Delaware State, with finding out that he has an uncle of color, and so that there, and it's a way for him to accentuate the seriousness of his own cause, to make it parallel. But you do have to ask yourself, are these really parallel causes in the way you're saying, right? Sure, they encounter prejudice and they would encounter marginalization, but there's I think there is an open debate out there in the atheist community about whether they should call this a civil rights cause, right? Because it's pretty easy to pass if you're an atheist, and not, like you're saying, just kind of not have this kind of issues come up, right? So, Gary DeYoung would say that, well, then you're just leaving all these things in place, and you're not really being treated equally if you're just passing all the time. But it does seem to me to be fundamentally different kinds of issues. These kind of racial prejudices he's talking about, fighting those kinds of causes and these kinds of causes. It just seems to me that we wouldn't want to make them equal in some kind of way. They're both civil rights questions, but they're not. The one is much. An interesting question: how to weigh these things and relate them to each other. And he's one of the few that really entangles them rhetorically. You don't see this as much, but in his life they are entangled in very intentional ways rhetorically. but it's hard to sort out. There was a big debate about a decade or so ago in some of the atheist periodicals about whether there would, to see these atheist issues as civil rights, so in civil rights terms. There's a group in Philadelphia that kind of collects cases of prejudice against atheists, workplace discrimination, school cases, all these kinds of things. And so there are people that collect them and put them into these categories about discrimination, and there are others that make this point that you really shouldn't be talking about them quite this way, in the way you're saying, right? It doesn't quite rise to that anymore.
Well, I think we probably should thank our